This week on Brian Ross Investigates. After protests, lawsuits, and federal investigations into the nationwide epidemic of prescription painkillers, the makers of Oxycontin agreed to pay $8 billion and plead guilty to 3 felony counts. But no criminal charges against any executives or the family that owns the company, the Sacklers. We're joined by the artist who led protests against the museums that took big money from the Sacklers, Nan Goldin.
People wrote to congratulate me, but this isn't a win, it's a spin. There's no justice in this case.
And the author of the groundbreaking book, Painkiller, journalist Barry Meier.
But no one's being held accountable for it. No one is being charged with encouraging doctors to prescribe Oxycontin unnecessarily when it wasn't medically appropriate.
Plus, counting the vote in the most consequential election of the century. What could go wrong and what needs to be done now to protect your vote and your country. We're joined by the former White House cyber czar, Richard Clarke. And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite about who's on top and who is not.
Well, we are making efforts to contain it.
By running all over the country not wearing a mask?
Jake,
that's what the vice president's doing.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our viewers on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined this evening, as always, by my colleague at Law&Crime, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with the question of whether the punishment fits the crime, involving a Department of Justice action against a man-made epidemic that grew out of greed. The addiction in this country that caused so many deaths and suffering of painkillers, opioid painkillers. The Department of Justice announced action against the company that makes Oxycontin, Purdue Pharma. The company is owned privately by one family, the Sackler family, best known for the millions of dollars they've given to museums around the world. But the question remains, is the punishment fitting the crime for what happened? Rhonda?
Purdue Pharma pled guilty to 3 felony counts, the company that makes Oxycontin, and they've agreed to pay an $8 billion fine. But none of the Sackler family or members, the executives who run the company, are facing criminal charges.
The Justice Department called the action a major development, but many were skeptical. We're joined now by 2 people who were instrumental in focusing public attention on the opioid addiction and the role of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. Nan Goldin, the artist who has helped lead the group called P.A.I.N, Prescription Addiction Intervention Now, with her protests against museums that had Sackler money. And Barry Meier, the former New York Times journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, who wrote Painkiller, An Empire of Deceit. Thank you both for joining us. Nan, let me start with you. We were there with you night after night when you went to the protest in museums and tried to get the Sackler name and bring attention to their role in all this. What's your reaction to this settlement with the Justice Department?
People wrote to congratulate me, but this isn't a win, it's a spin. There's no justice in this case. They're walking away with a tiny fine, much like in 2007. There's no documents being released. There's nobody standing trial. They haven't finished doing their investigation. The Sackler family is still being deposed, and they didn't wait for that. It's not a good settlement. It's not a good outcome. It's not justice for the families.
Barry Meier, the settlement was for $8.3 billion. The company agreed to plead guilty to 3 felony counts. What do you say about it?
Well, we've kind of seen this play before, Brian. In 2007, the company pled guilty to a felony count. Now it's just acknowledged the fact that it's a serial offender. Picking up on what Nan just said, these are like suddenly immaculate crimes. You know, Purdue became involved in some sort of pump and dump scheme to get doctors to prescribe more Oxycontin, but no one's being held accountable for it. No one is being charged with encouraging doctors to prescribe Oxycontin unnecessarily when it wasn't medically appropriate. And for some reason, the Justice Department didn't feel secure in its case or wanted to rush it through and agreed to a settlement where the Sackler family didn't even have to acknowledge that it had done anything wrong. So the question is, why wasn't this case, like the last case, pursued in court? Let the truth come out there, let the government win, let the Sacklers win. But really, after 20 years, it's time to have this adjudicated in a courtroom rather than in a back room.
Nan and Goldin, the $8.3 billion, according to the Justice Department, will provide what they call extraordinary new resources to help fight addiction.
If approved by the court, will redress past wrongs and will also provide extraordinary new resources for the treatment and care of those affected by opioids addiction.
What do you say about that?
First of all, they've politicized the opioid crisis, which is just so cynical. They're trying to make it go away. They're trying to rush it through. And I have a big question. What is the difference between the Sacklers and Purdue? It was their private company. So I don't see how this distinction is constantly being made. I'd like to see them go to jail.
Much of this $8 billion is a fantasy figure. They're not going to collect most of it because Purdue's in bankruptcy. So why not just go to court? Let the truth come out. I would be the first one to applaud Purdue or the Sackler family for going to court, reclaiming their reputation, what have you. But, you know, we're trapped in this world of legal cowardice where everyone says, well, we're settling the case not because we did something wrong, but because of the costs or the uncertainty of litigation. After 20 years, let's have the truth, let's see how it plays, and let's see who's not guilty.
Nan, in your protests that you led at the various museums around the United States and overseas, you were very effective in getting these big institutions to essentially stop taking Sackler money, to take the names off extensions and halls that they had contributed to. Are you going to continue that?
I'm sorry, Brian. Only the Louvre has taken their name down, and Tufts University. What we've been effective at is getting the museums and universities to stop taking their funding. But we're not done now. The one thing that has been, we've been successful and that we feel some indication now after the case is that NYU announced that they're taking the Sackler name off of everything having to do with the medical school. So the students won't be graduating with the name of malpractice on their portfolios going forward. And now, evidently, DIA has wiped their name off their website, and the Met is considering taking down their name. And that was the first place that we did a protest. So it's sort of the most important to us.
And finally, Barry, are the Sacklers, the Sackler family members who were involved in the operations of Purdue Pharma, are they off the hook completely now?
Well, it depends what happens in the bankruptcy court case. They could get liability protection against civil lawsuits. You know, the Justice Department, in making this, or trumpeting this announcement on Thursday, was waving a stick and saying, our investigation is continuing. People, including the Sackler family, could be charged in the future. My only, my parting word would be simply, don't hold your breath. The Justice Department has displayed its cowardlessness in the past. It's how they roll, and it's how I can, anticipate things continuing.
Nan Goldin and Barry Meier, thank you both for joining us this evening. Very interesting to talk with you, and we'll stay on the story.
Thanks, Brian.
Please do, Brian. Thank you.
In a statement, the Sackler family said any criminality at the Purdue Pharma Company was the result of actions by lower-level employees. The family will pay some $225 million in civil fines. Coming up, uncertainty and anxiety over next week's election. What's going to happen? Will the votes be counted? We're joined by the former White House cyber czar, Richard Clarke, when we return. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates. Next, what some are calling the most consequential election in American history. Election day next week, well, more than 60 million people have already cast ballots amid uncertainty and anxiety over whether the ballots will be counted, whether others will meddle in the election, whether votes will be suppressed. Joining us to talk about that is the former White House cyber czar, Richard Clarke, author of many books on the cyber wars and the fifth domain. Mr. Clarke, thank you so much for joining us. What are your great concerns and fears about what might happen next week?
Well, Brian, I think our greatest fear is that we don't know. We don't believe that the Russians will do exactly the same thing that they did 4 years ago. We know they're active. The FBI has publicly said that they're active, trying to interfere with the election. We don't know all of the techniques and tools that they're using this time and how they're different. So we have, over the course of the next 6 days or so, the possibility that they will do something that we haven't anticipated. But what we do know that they've done in the past is to misdirect people on social media. They tell people that voting has been extended, so you don't have to vote on Tuesday. They tell people the wrong place to vote, that sort of thing. They try to get people to vote for third-party candidates or not to vote at all. So there's that working of the system through social media. The other thing we know that they've done in the past is get into voter registration lists, to hack into the state government election bureaus and to access the voter registration lists. Now, one thing you could do with that is you could rewrite it so that when people who are trying to vote in person show up, their name isn't on the list. Or their name is on the list for a different location. What that does is slows down the process, makes the lines longer. And if you can make the lines long in particular precincts of battleground states, you might be able to affect the outcome.
Mr. Clarke, we know the White House has not taken a leadership role, but are agencies of the government working on this, trying to set up defensive lines?
Well, you're right. And in the normal government in the past, there would have been a White House coordination effort to achieve a whole of government effort here. That's not happening. But despite the absence of the White House at the table, the key agencies are active. They are coordinating together without a leader. So Cyber Command and NSA at Fort Meade in Maryland, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI have created something called the Russia Small Group, which is coordinating both offensive and defensive activity. We're led to believe that Cyber Command is doing things to disrupt efforts by the Russian intelligence agency, GRU. So they're doing offense, but they're also doing defense, attempting to detect things, attempting to block things. They are very active, and that's much different than 4 years ago.
A question for you, Dick, from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
In the last election, the Russians planted all sorts of disinformation on Facebook. What is Facebook doing differently in this go-around?
Well, the Russians are still planting disinformation on Facebook, but at least this time, Facebook is looking for it. And Facebook and Twitter have both hired thousands of people, and they're also using artificial intelligence bots to look for disinformation. They're finding it, they're blocking it. But the problem is the Russians just then pop up under another name, always pretending to be an American, sometimes pretending to be African American, sometimes pretending to be environmentalists in the United States. but they're constantly changing their names, and it's a never-ending battle for social media to find them. But I would say Facebook and Twitter and Reddit are all trying, which is not something they tried 4 years ago. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be that level of interest over at Google and its YouTube division, which doesn't seem to be doing much at all.
Dick, last week, the director of national intelligence and the head of the FBI pointed fingers at both Russia and Iran. What's the deal with Iran?
Well, Brian, when they did that, that was the most bizarre press conference I'd seen in Washington in a long time. And that's saying something, as you know. The very political director of national intelligence, a former Republican congressman with few qualifications in intelligence, he's been there for a few months, the director of national intelligence, Radcliffe, held a press conference at night. It was very hurried. There was not much lead announcement for the press to get there. And he dragged along the FBI director, who frankly looked like he was reading a hostage video. And the FBI director, in that statement that he read, said nothing. But what Radcliffe said was, we know that Russia is trying to interfere in the election. Well, of course we do. But then he added, and so is Iran, and didn't quantify or qualify their role. Iran's doing very, very little compared to the Russians. Iran appears to have sent out some direct emails to people in Florida, but it doesn't seem to be very well written. It doesn't seem to be very effective. I can only imagine that the reason for that press conference is that the president has been yelling at his various subordinates to do something. And when he heard that Iran was doing anything, he probably yelled at Radcliffe, hold a press conference tonight, and say it's not just Russia, it's Iran.
All right, Richard Clarke, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be watching what happens next week and hope to talk to you more about this. Coming up, this week's winners and losers in the media as chosen by Mediaite. See if you agree with what they have to say about the president's daughter, Ivanka. You're watching Brian Ross Investigate. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media as chosen by the editors at Mediaite. And we're joined by the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, Aidan Mclaughlin. Mediaite, which, like Law and Crime Trial Network, is all part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, the first choice for the winner this week, Jake Tapper of CNN for his interview with White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Here's a key clip from that interview.
We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation
Why aren't we going to get
areas
control of the pandemic?
Because it is a contagious virus, just like the flu.
Yeah, but why not make efforts to contain it?
Well, we are making efforts to contain it.
By running all over the country, not wearing a mask?
Jake,
that's what the vice president's doing.
And Aidan, that made headlines around the world.
Yeah, so it was a pretty stunning omission from Mark Meadows, who's Donald Trump's chief of staff. You have to remember the context of this interview. It comes on a weekend when it was revealed that a number of advisors to Vice President Mike Pence had tested positive for coronavirus, including Mark Short, his own chief of staff. So Mark Meadows goes on the Sunday shows to sort of clean it up and put a rosy face on what looks like another coronavirus outbreak at the White House. And tells Jake Tapper this pretty stunning admission that the White House doesn't see it as possible to get control of the virus. He said, we're going to try and control all these other variables. The point he's making is obviously that the virus is something that has hit every country in the world and that is hard to completely avoid or impossible to completely avoid. But it's still remarkable for an official to basically shrug their shoulders and say, we're not going to get control of this virus. The best we could do is just try and live with it. Jake Tapper was able to get that quote out of Mark Meadows in an interview that was remarkable for other reasons as well, and that has pretty much driven the news cycle this week.
Absolutely. It appeared that the White House was waving a white flag of surrender to the virus. Your loser this week, also from the White House, the president's daughter, Ivanka. Why was she considered a loser by the editors of Mediaite?
Right. So Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump actually Ivanka posted a tweet yesterday in which she posed with her mail-in ballot. And you can see her there alongside the president. Now, this might come as a shock if you get your news from President Donald Trump's Twitter feed. The president has for months been railing against mail-in ballots and has basically accused the practice of leading to rampant fraud. So the fact that the president is attacking mail-in voting, which has been adopted by a lot of states during the coronavirus pandemic, and then you have Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner posing with mail-in ballots, it certainly points out a hypocrisy of the White House's position. The president, hours after Ivanka Trump posted that photo, was back to railing against mail-in voting, and also said that it shouldn't, that votes received after Election Day should not be counted, which is seen as sort of his long-running attempt to delegitimize votes counted after Election Day, which is something that is done in every election in American history. We might have a longer process this year just because of the pandemic, but his attacks on the electoral process, you combine that with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner voting by mail, it wasn't a great moment for the White House.
And we've just got 30 seconds, but she was supposed to be the secret weapon for the president.
That's right. And I think she's been not the best advisor for the president here. Her tone is often conflicts with the president's, whether it's on the campaign trail. She promotes initiatives that the president doesn't really seem to care about. And it's sort of, I think, probably a relic from an administration that has a little bit more of a normal tone.
Absolutely. Well, Aidan Mclaughlin, the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, thank you so much. We're watching closely what happens next week as the election takes place. A lot to talk about, media winners and losers. So thanks again, and thanks to all of you for joining us. And thanks again to the great team at the Law and Crime Network, which successfully gets us on the air and gets us off the air. Good night.